Over the last 10 years, Assassin's Creed has become Ubisoft's flagship moneymaker, and as a longtime fan of the series, I can definitely say it's had its fair share of ups and downs during that time, with narrative, gameplay, and marketing decisions sometimes being pretty hit or miss. But one thing that has stayed consistent across each installment of this now long-running franchise is the amazing historical settings they let us explore. Ubisoft set the standard for creating period piece maps that are historically accurate, intricately detailed, and generally just plain gorgeous to look at. Given that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is coming out next week, I wanted to take the time to rank all 11 of the mainline Assassin's Creed games based on something I actually think is pretty solid in each one: the setting. I'm basing my opinions on how aesthetically pleasing these settings are, but also how enjoyable they are to explore, and how well the games take advantage of the settings in terms of plot and gameplay. Now, all of these settings are really good and they're worth checking out, but some of them are just clearly a cut above the others, acting as standouts not only within the franchise, but within the industry as a whole. Being the less advertised of two Assassin's Creed games that actually came out in 2014, Assassin's Creed Rogue is one of the more overlooked installments in the series by far. The game takes place in the northeast of the North American continent during the 7 Years' War, and it functions as a fusion of the colonial setting of Assassin's Creed 3 and the open seas of Assassin's Creed 4. Now, taken on its own, the game is beautiful. It takes players further north, for one, than any game in a pre-Valhalla world, and the snowy shipwrecks to explore and the walls of ice are all very unique to this game. Whether you're against the backdrop of snowy mountains, or you're just sailing through the lush river valley, pretty much any screenshot in this game could be mistaken for a Bob Ross painting. Where it stumbles, however, is in creating an identity for itself. There isn't a whole lot in Assassin's Creed Rogue we haven't seen before, and with a higher budget to boot. The River Valley region feels kind of like a more restrictive version of AC3's Frontier that you can sail your boat through, and the North Atlantic feels very much like the Caribbean from Assassin's Creed 4 with a very thinly veiled coat of paint. The game's only real city, New York, is one we had already explored, and while it let us get a look at what the city might have looked like before the Great Fire burned down a large portion of it, I didn't find that added a lot of variety to the city, with the newly formed blocks feeling pretty familiar to what we already had. But the icing on top, and perhaps the biggest problem here, is that in a series that prides itself so highly on historical accuracy, especially within its maps, so many liberties are taken with the locales here, with the River Valley especially being almost entirely fictional. This valley that runs through the East Coast just doesn't exist, at least not in the context the game puts it in. You take a town like Albany, for example, which in real life is very flat, whereas in this game it's surrounded by these towering snow-capped mountains. Real locations are just scattered through this fantasy map, and some are more bizarre than others. I've never been to Mount Vernon, Virginia, but something tells me it's not a short trip away from Sleepy Hollow, New York, which in this game is an island for some reason, and I just don't know what spurred that choice. As far as video game maps go, Rogue's world is very pretty, but it would leave the average Assassin's Creed player with a been there, done that feeling, and would leave anybody from the region scratching their head as to what exactly these maps are trying to represent. After spending 2 consecutive games exploring Renaissance Italy, the franchise needed a change, and Assassin's Creed Revelations delivered with Constantinople. The city is one of the most colorful and vibrant in the series, and its historical significance as the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire and as a crossroads between East and West, as the game puts it, is very alluring. Unfortunately, like Rogue, Revelations was more of an in-between game while the real big-budget titles were happening elsewhere, and the setting suffers for it. When the novelty of the new environment wears off, the player is left with a sizable map that doesn't have any real variety to it. While Ubisoft advertised different districts that we'd be able to explore, the whole map really blends together, with the same buildings being repeated over and over, and landmarks like the incredible Hagia Sophia, Grand Bazaar, and Galata Tower really aren't enough to break that monotony. Ezio also explores Cappadocia, which is an underground city controlled by the Templars, and it's a cool but really brief excursion to a unique locale that I ultimately found forgettable. The game does add some really cool traversal mechanics to go along with Ezio's new tool, the hook blade, and the extra boost up a building or chaining together a bunch of ziplines does add a lot to the feel of the city itself. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of staying power to this iteration of Constantinople, and once you've explored one block, you've effectively seen everything the game has to offer you. Assassin's Creed 3 marked a huge departure for the series when it traded in towering cathedrals and busy streets for brick-and-mortar churches and the open wilderness. For starters, the scale of Assassin's Creed 3 was leagues beyond anything we had ever seen in the series before, with a frontier map containing everything from wooded forests to sparsely populated farmland. The game also featured a dynamic weather system, and seasons would change depending on where you were in the story, which gave some much-needed personality to the different regions. The cities themselves, Boston and New York, were much more subdued than cities we'd seen in previous installments. While getting to see these modern-day behemoths as smaller colonial towns was really cool from a historical perspective, they weren't as interesting to traverse as some of the other cities on this list. For starters, the cities don't distinguish themselves from one another very well aside from a weird filter Ubisoft threw over New York, and leaping from rooftop to rooftop just felt serviceable compared to what we were used to at the time. Now, when the game came out, I understood that sacrifices would have to be made if they were going to stay true to the setting, and my hope was that they'd make up for it by innovating tree-to-tree platforming in the same way the series changed platforming in an urban environment in 2007. Unfortunately, traversing the forests really lacks the freedom that made Assassin's Creed stand out from other open-world platformers. While AC as a franchise never had very mechanically interesting or challenging platforming, it made up for it by breaking new ground with the number of points of contact your character could grab, letting you freely climb almost anywhere. This stood in stark contrast to the industry standard of jumping from marked ledge to marked ledge on a linear path. You don't get the same freedom in the forests of AC3. While you can climb any building in the city, only a few of the trees are actually climbable, and while branching paths do exist, in general one tree will just lead you to another single tree. This creates a gameplay loop where you hop on a rock or a log that takes you up into the branches above, and you follow the linear path the devs laid out for you before being deposited back on the ground a few dozen meters later. It feels very linear compared to running on rooftops, and there isn't much room for strategic navigation. As a result of all these things, I often found myself hopping on a horse to get from point A to point B, because it wasn't that much less interesting than any of the other options I had. However, I must say, the game does a really good job of trying to give the player an idea of what life might have been like during this time period, and the homestead missions especially are a great exploration of the different ways of life people could have undertaken at the time. Watching animals on a hunt, or observing one of your homesteaders, or just sitting on the deck of the Aquila and looking at your crew while they try to keep your ship afloat are all very immersive, and you can see the hard work that went into studying the time period. I just wish it was a little more interesting to explore, and better designed from a gameplay perspective. This was the game that started it all, and in spite of its many flaws, it set a high bar when it came to making beautiful recreations of historical settings. Like its mission structure, the original Assassin's Creed's Third Crusade architecture gets repetitive over time. The three cities, Jerusalem, Acre, and Damascus, are all pretty similar in terms of layout and building structure. Ubisoft tried to make them easier to differentiate by giving them weird filters that fail to mask that repetition. Acre is grayish, Damascus is sepia, and Jerusalem has a greenish-yellow tinge to it. While the architecture doesn't do the best job of making these cities feel unique from one another, the original game did an amazing job of creating specific atmospheres with each city. As you walk through the streets, you'll hear these orators spewing propaganda against the enemy, and I have so many voice lines seared into my brain involving the evils of the infidel king or the incoming Saracen army. It really makes you feel like you're a third party, caught in the middle of a world-changing war, an enemy to both sides that lurks in the shadows. No game since this first one has done quite so good a job at creating an atmosphere like that. The game as a whole is hard to go back to because of its age, but it's impossible to deny that the foundations of Assassin's Creed's world design were firmly planted here. As gorgeous as Ezio's fledgling adventure was, it seemed like a massive loss that we only got a small taste of Rome at the very end of the game. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood rectified this, giving us the first game in the series that would eschew traveling between regions in favor of creating a single, well-built city. Despite only having one map, Brotherhood's Rome managed to be plenty varied for the purposes of the game. Vatican City feels distinguishable from the city proper, and the wide-open countryside is littered with gorgeous digital recreations of some of our planet's most recognizable landmarks. Climbing to the top of the Colosseum or parachuting down from the Castel Sant'Angelo had a real sense of grandeur that the series hadn't really seen at that point. Now, despite my love for this setting, I do have to acknowledge that it was, in many ways, more of the same of what we got in Assassin's Creed 2. A lot of the assets are reused, and obviously the world as a whole is very much in line with what we saw in the previous game, albeit much, much prettier. And while Jesper Kid's incredible soundtrack is still very effective, the ambiance and tone are all very familiar. These aren't bad things, but, because of them, it's hard for me to put this game higher than other installments that actively gave us entirely new experiences. This was a tough one for me, because when it just comes to the sheer, unadulterated beauty of a setting, Unity's recreation of Paris could easily take the cake. The first real 8th generation title came out swinging when it came to setting, with Paris being meticulously detailed and stunningly gorgeous, easily competing with other open-world cities at a graphical level even 6 years after launch. This was the first game in the series to be made at a 1-to-1 scale, making it feel so much bigger and more substantial than any of the other games in the series. And crowd sizes were also increased by a huge margin. But it's the little details that matter just as much in this game. NPCs will go about their daily lives and perform tasks, and the player is free to follow them and observe them for a taste of what life in the big city might have been like in the late 1700s. And while the main characters all speak with British accents, which was definitely a controversial decision among the community, a majority of the NPCs will actually speak in French, making it very easy to immerse yourself in the world if you just take a second to sit back and observe it. You could even watch a play at a cafe if you really have time. Like the rest of the game, however, Paris does have some glaring issues. For starters, it's very difficult to mention anything about this game without also mentioning the performance issues, and those do have an impact on the setting. Paris is near perfect if you're standing still, but it's hard to appreciate all those little details when they are loading in bulk in front of your eyes. The impressive crowds I mentioned are especially graphically unstable, with clothes, textures, and entire character models constantly popping in and out of existence while you're looking at them. That's to say nothing of the fact that on the PS4, you're more than likely going to be experiencing a lot of this game in the 20 FPS region. But much more important than performance issues is the fact that there isn't a lot of fun stuff to do in the city. As I said, it's amazing to look at, but it really left me wanting when it came to gameplay. The game came out at the height of the trend where maps were just being filled to the brim with meaningless collectibles and dull, forgettable side missions, and there are hundreds of chests and other collectibles in this game that fill up a majority of the map. It feels much more bloated than any of its sibling games. The side content also doesn't add a whole lot to the setting or the characters, with the majority of them being quirky, short, one-off side stories in which Arno is really just a player avatar, given that he doesn't really speak at all outside of the short main campaign. You spend a lot of time running places, pressing a single button to either kill someone or interact with something, and then run other places. And because, like Rogue, you only see about half the map in the main campaign, a lot of your exposure to the city is going to be through these half-baked side missions. It all falls short of some of the really cool side activities we've had access to in other titles, especially coming right after AC4, which was full of varied content. In spite of these flaws, it's impossible to deny how gorgeous this game is, even if it did come at a cost to performance. If anyone else decided to put Unity as their top dog, I really couldn't fault them. Following up Assassin's Creed Unity, I have another game that totally delivers on beauty, but does stumble a bit in the gameplay department. However, the problems I have with Odyssey are very, very different from the ones I had with Unity. AC Odyssey is basically the perfect photo mode game. There is so much to see, so many people to meet, and so many wonders of the world to experience, and at almost every turn I was greeted by another vista that seemed unparalleled in the gaming world. Just when you think the game is out of tricks, it throws you another view that forces you to just stop and take it in. This was the first game in the series to really make me realize how culturally significant these games have the capacity to be.
Where else exists such a thorough, passionately made simulation of these locales that haven't existed in this way for 2.5 millennia? I get that it's heavily dramatized for the sake of entertainment, but it's still an absolutely amazing achievement. Athens alone is a place I could walk around and stare at for weeks without seeing every little detail the devs put in it.
But chances are you won't want to sit and observe NPCs, because there's so much fun stuff to do in this game. You can sail to coastal islands on your ship, the Adrestia. You can explore the fully rendered bed of the Aegean Sea. You can search for clues in different towns to track down assassination targets. It's almost overwhelming how many options you have while playing this game, and the player is free to do whatever they want. I sunk 130 hours into the game before putting it down. Now, having a massive open world is awesome, but it also has to be fun to traverse, which is where Odyssey stumbles a bit.
For starters, the map can get really repetitive. This game has so much to show, but a lot of the amazing work the designers did in creating their vision of Greece gets lost in the seemingly endless hills and plains that seem to be there just to pad out the size of the game. For every super unique locale, like a red lake, or a salt mining town, or a pit with really weird, eerie mud statues, there is another mountain that feels like it was copied and pasted from the last one, with 3 identical camps at each corner. This game would have felt no less epic and would have only felt cleaner if they hadn't been so focused on size. Had they condensed this map a little bit, I think it would have made for a much more consumable experience. Another big problem I have with it is that there's a very distinct lack of verticality in this game. This is the only installment in the series in which there really isn't a place in the game that you're going to be hopping from rooftop to rooftop, and this is one of the most important itches for an AC game to scratch. Odyssey is very much lacking here. As grand as Athens and Sparta are, you're going to be spending a lot of your time on foot, and I wish they could have given us at least a few areas where we could free run around to our heart's content, given that they clearly didn't mind taking some liberties with historical accuracy anyway. Even when Ubisoft decided to build ancient Isu cities from scratch for the DLC, they failed to make the free-running system all that enjoyable, despite seeming like that was the perfect opportunity for some more complex design. And, as a side note, when it comes to immersion and the Greek power fantasy, having every character in the game except for you get a shield was a pretty questionable design choice. I understand that Greece doesn't lend itself particularly well to vertical gameplay, but I wish the devs would have put more effort into utilizing the agility of our main character.
Odyssey's classical Greece is an incredible feat for historians and gamers alike to gush over all the same. I just hope future installments do a better job of making the trip from point A to point B as fun as it is gorgeous.
Assassin's Creed Syndicate came out at a time when franchise fatigue was at an all-time high, and as a result, it's been kind of forgotten over time. And that's a real shame, because Syndicate's iteration of Victorian London really is wonderful to explore. Now, I can't talk about London without acknowledging the important influence of Unity's Paris, with the architecture being very similar and a lot of the assets really just being reskinned.
On the surface, the game isn't as technically impressive as Unity, but it's much more graphically stable, and they were able to re-include the day-night system, which I had missed in Paris. It doesn't hit the extreme graphical highs that Unity and Odyssey did, but it also doesn't suffer from the same problems. London is the most modern and probably the most vertical city in the series. And while I love the Notre Dame, there's nothing really like zooming to the top of Big Ben and overlooking the entire city of London. It's really cool and unique.
While I'm glad the rope launcher was a one-time thing, I do appreciate that it allowed for wider streets that didn't have a bunch of random ropes connecting the rooftops like in Unity.
In addition to that, Syndicate's world just feels so alive. You can free run around to your heart's content, just like in any other game, but this was also the first game to include vehicles, so you could actually ride across town on a carriage, and your home base is on a train, which is pretty fitting for the setting. Activities like taking down factories that abuse child labor, or participating in an underground fighting club, really serve the setting. And sitting on a boat and drifting down the Thames makes for some pretty cool views.
London is also the most modern city we've seen, with massive glass train stations and dirty factories being a far cry from the pre-Industrial Revolution games in the series.
We got 4 mainline games in a row set in the 1700s, and this relatively short jump to the mid-1800s does a lot of work in making the setting feel unique. One criticism I could easily see leveled at the game is the fact that the atmosphere is much lighter than the dark, gritty feel people tend to associate with Victorian London. This game really doesn't go that direction, and if you go into the game understandably expecting that, you probably won't warm up to the setting as much as I did. But Ubisoft made the London they wanted to make, and that London is sprawling, dynamic, and a lot of fun. As far as big cities in the Assassin's Creed franchise go, London is the one I find most impressive.
If fans thought the American frontier was a big shift, they were definitely in for it when AC4 set its story on the open sea and lawless islands of the Caribbean. Taking place as the golden age of piracy in the West was waning, the player spends as much time sailing on their trusty jackdaw as they do climbing buildings. Ubisoft took a real gamble in shifting the setting so much, and it paid off in spades. Exploration was exciting, and it felt like there was something new around every corner. Instead of eagle vision, on your ship you have access to your spyglass, and that lets you scout out enemy ships and new, undiscovered landmasses. It's so easy to just get lost in this world, charting new islands and following treasure maps to caves with long-lost loot. More than any other game in the series, AC4 immerses you in the time period through masterful world design and really fun side activities. Hunting sharks and whales for goods is thrilling, albeit ethically painful at times, and upgrading your ship until you can take on any man of war in the ocean gives you much more of a sense of power progression than any game prior to it. It makes perfect use of the pirate setting by letting you be a pirate, while keeping the same core land-based mechanics from AC3. In addition to this, the cities are pretty solid and have a lot of personality. Havana and Kingston feel much more different from one another than most of the main cities do in these games, with Havana's Spanish influence and ambient soundtrack feeling starkly different from Kingston's subdued English style. It does the best job of any game since the original of making you feel like you're exploring a world where multiple different cultures are coalescing, both in cooperation and in conflict. Now, all of this exists on the backbone of the fact that the story in this game handles its historical subject matter better than any other game before or since, doing an amazing job portraying the tail end of this era of piracy, while also integrating Edward and the Assassin's Creed elements that come with him much more organically than games like AC3 did. You can feel the love that went into making this game's iteration of the Caribbean, and everything from the story to the gameplay to the side content all work together to make this game a cohesive experience centered around this amazing period in history. The original Assassin's Creed may have set the foundation, but it was this much-lauded sequel where things really got serious. As fascinating as the Holy Land was, Renaissance Italy was grand, majestic, and fun to play. Florence and Venice are both amazing cities, and while they're similar from an architectural perspective, each feels fresh and different from the other. Florence, being the wealthy city tucked into the mountains, feels tight and easy to navigate, which is very different from Venice, which has its bright colors and interweaving canals, and a much more spread out structure. These cities alone would have been enough to vastly improve over the original, but AC2 also includes the spectacular towers of San Gimignano, the tranquil villas of the Tuscan countryside, and the marshy fortress of Forli. Even though these maps are tiny compared to what we have today, AC2 presented an incredible sense of scale and adventure, making the player feel like they were really on a journey that could span 2 decades in several cities. You even get your own mansion at your home base, and the player can decorate and renovate it, becoming its own character in the story. But even with all of these things excelling like they do, none of it would have mattered half as much if it weren't for Jesper Kid's amazing soundtrack. The ambient music in this game is the best in the series, and it presses the players forward emotionally for the entirety of the 15 or so hour plot. The game also encourages you to learn more about the time period. It gives you just enough history to pique your interest in learning more on your own, which is what an Assassin's Creed game should do. Taking down high-ranking Templars with the help of local thieves, courtesans, and mercenaries gives you a glimpse at the class dynamics that are being portrayed in this world, which also adds a lot of personality to the cities. At the end of the day, the worlds have gotten bigger and bigger both in terms of size and content, but Renaissance Italy is so compact, beautiful, and fun that it still surpasses a vast majority of what would come. As I've discussed, every Assassin's Creed game has done a great job of transporting players through time and appealing to that part of us that wants to explore lost civilizations. But no game does it more respectfully, with more attention to culture, scale, and detail than Assassin's Creed Origins and its portrayal of Ptolemaic Egypt. This game appeals to every fantasy I've ever had about exploring the Egypt of old. This game gives us not one, but two great wonders of the world. Scaling the pyramids of Giza is surpassed only by sliding down the other side, and the interiors of the pyramids were recreated with an incredibly thorough attention to detail. The scale of the Lighthouse of Alexandria is absolutely immense, and it feels just as impressive to climb as any tower the series has ever given us. To say nothing of the cultural significance of the city of Alexandria itself. The Roman influence is clear, and it's just as fun as ever to explore this massive city. It's incredible to think that a city this large and impressive existed 2,000 years ago, and I still get chills hopping from rooftop to rooftop while soldiers race through the streets on chariots below. Plus, seeing the Library of Alexandria is awesome, and it makes you wonder what our world would have been like if we hadn't lost the immense knowledge that city contained. And this city takes up such a small portion of this game's map. While Odyssey oftentimes felt bloated and padded out, every part of Egypt here felt like it was placed deliberately and adds to the gameplay. Every town and oasis and agricultural hub is a wonder to explore and observe, and the world never gets stale. The thrill I get from climbing a mountain overlooking a town is immediately overshadowed by the thrill of sailing a boat down the Nile, dodging crocodiles, or stumbling across a heavily fortified enemy fortress. Even the massive desert in this game doesn't feel like too much, and I love the atmosphere you get when you see Bayek slowly lose his mind as he succumbs to exhaustion, heat, and dehydration in the middle of a seemingly endless sea of sand. All of this is to say nothing of the fact that the game is also really fun. There's a lot to see, but there's also a lot to do. You want to fight in the arena? Go ahead. You want to race around the hippodrome? Why not? Want to explore a mummy tomb, or battle a giant war elephant, or kill a giant Egyptian god? You can do all that stuff. Ubisoft went all out when it came to giving players a near-perfect historical setting and filling it with interesting things to do. Over the 60 hours I spent with it, I never got bored, and I still go back now and am amazed by the detail and passion that went into creating this absolute masterpiece of a setting. With this in mind, Valhalla has some big shoes to fill next week. The same team that made Egypt has been working on recreating 9th century England, and I'm really excited to see where that locale will place on this list once we get to experience it. Until then, for all this series' ups and downs, I'm amazed that I've gotten the chance to explore all of these wonderful time periods, and I hope to see many more great ones in the future. That's all for my list. If you like my video, please feel free to let me know in the comments, and if you want, let me know what setting you'd like to see the series tackle next. Have a wonderful day, and please stay safe.